Chapter 16, The Spectre. Completely stunned by the announcement of Roy Chatley and Janet Lee, Nancy's group stood as if rooted to the spot. They could not believe what they had just heard. The brother and sister were moving in and asking the others to move out. "Well, aren't you fellows going to help me with the bags?" Roy asked in an irritable voice. As Nancy found her voice and introduced Mrs. Gruen and the boys, Ned stepped forward and said, "As soon as I'm told it's all right, I'll be glad to help you with your luggage." Janet tossed her head. "Well, if all the nerve! Here we are, the grandchildren of the man who owned this place, and you're telling us what to do." By now, Nancy had decided what to do. She hurried into the house and dashed upstairs to Grandfather Sakamaki's bedroom. Adjoining it was a small study with a telephone. She closed the door and put in a call to Mr. Dutton, the executor. When Nancy related what had happened, the trust officer was stunned by the news. "This makes a complicated situation indeed," he said, "but I suppose we have no right to keep Mrs. Lee and her brother out. They are as entitled to visit the estate as is your friend Mr. Sakamaki or any friends he sends there." "I suppose so," Nancy agreed. "I only hope they'll be pleasant." Mr. Dutton sighed. "I wish I could help you, but at the moment nothing occurs to me. Just this morning I was going over the credentials of Mrs. Lee and Mr. Chatley. They certainly seem to be all right. Among the things is a photograph of the grave of old Mr. Sakamaki's first wife, their grandmother. Then they had other papers to prove that she had just one child, a daughter. The photograph of this woman proved that she looked very much like her mother. Then there were other old photographs of Mr. Sakamaki's first wife with her grandchildren. They certainly resembled Janet and Roy. Also, they produced newspaper clippings of the death notice and funeral of their mother. Nancy was impressed. "It all sounds authentic," she said. "Yes, it does," Mr. Dutton agreed. "Another thing, Mr. Chatley brought an old letter of his grandmother's to a friend, telling how her husband had left her when their daughter was a baby, and that he had gone to Honolulu." "It sounds very plausible," Nancy had to admit. "Mr. Dutton, as you know, my father is in Los Angeles trying to check the same story. I talked with him on the phone this morning, and he said something had come up which had made him decide to stay over and do some further investigating. Maybe he'll uncover additional facts that will disprove Roy's claim." Nancy then told of the proposed trip to Maui and the Haleakala crater. She explained about the little metal chest and the pictures on the paper found inside. "How interesting," the executor remarked. "It may or may not mean anything," said Nancy, "but I suspect it's a good clue to the mystery of Kaluakua. I'd planned to fly today to the area where the Silver Sword plants are, but I hate to go and leave Roy Chatley and his sister here." "I see," said Mr. Dutton. "Well, go ahead. I'll have a private detective named John Gerald come out to the house and stay while you're away." Nancy was relieved. "That's fine, Mr. Dutton." With a chuckle, she added, "I don't think we should tell Janet and Roy what his profession is." "Right," the executor agreed. "Mr. Gerald is of medium height and a bit overweight. I'll ask him to wear a green tie so that you'll recognize him. Goodbye, Miss Drew, and success on your search." Crossing the study, Nancy opened the door, walked through Mr. Sakamaki's bedroom, and into the hall. There she met Janet Lee and her brother. The young woman held 2 small suitcases, her brother 2 large ones. At this instant they thumped them down on the floor. "Roy," said Janet, "I'm going to look over all the rooms, then decide which ones you and I will occupy." "Most of them are taken," Nancy spoke up. "Suppose I show you 2 that are empty?" "Thank you, but I'll make my own decision," retorted Janet haughtily. "Since this house belongs partly to me, I think I have a right to sleep where I want to." Nancy did not argue with the woman. She and her friends would be leaving that afternoon and not returning for a while. Perhaps by the time they came back to Kaluakua, Mr. Drew would be there, and she could get his advice on the matter. Casually, Nancy said that she and her friends and Mrs. Gruen were making a trip to Maui to see the famous crater. When they returned, the group could discuss the matter of who should stay at the estate. Janet and Roy's faces lighted up, but their smiles faded when Nancy said, "Kaluakua is to have another guest for a short time. He will arrive soon. His name is Mr. John Jarrell. He's a very pleasant man, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his company." "What does he do?" Roy Chatley asked suspiciously. "Oh, he's interested in many things," Nancy replied non-committally. "He's really a very well-informed person. He'll be able to tell you a lot about the Hawaiian Islands and their legends and history." Leaving it to Mr. Jarrell to satisfy Roy's curiosity, Nancy rushed downstairs. She quickly told the others of her conversation with the executor and the fact that Mr. Jarrell was coming. "But I didn't tell Janet and Roy what his profession is." Bess laughed. "And we shan't give it away. I'll go and tell Keabu and Emma about it." She hurried away. George said in a giggling whisper that she had better go and rescue her bag from the bedroom before Roy decided it belonged to the estate. Everyone went upstairs and watched the newcomers choose their bedrooms. First, Ned's suitcase and clothes were rudely removed from his room by Roy. Nancy was dismayed because this was one of the most spacious rooms on the second floor, and she had planned that Mr. Drew would sleep in the room with Ned. "I think I'll take this room," Janet announced in grandiose style as she stopped in the doorway of the room which Nancy was sharing with Hannah. "I'd appreciate it if whoever is in here would remove these clothes." Nancy concealed her annoyance and said nothing. Bess and George helped her carry the clothes to a small room at the end of the hall. As George hung up the last dress, she said with flashing eyes, "Do you girls realize that those two have picked rooms from which they can watch everything that goes on?" "Yes, and everybody," added Bess. "It wouldn't surprise me if by the time we get back here, all the clothes we've left have been stolen." "Oh, I don't think we need to worry about that," said Nancy. She glanced at her watch. "We'd better grab some lunch and be on our way, or we'll miss our plane." Soon she and her friends were ready to leave. Suitcases were piled into the convertible's trunk, and its passengers began to climb in. Nancy was worried. Mr. Jarrell had not arrived, and she had great misgivings about leaving Janet Lee and Roy Chatley at Kaluakua without more professional guards than Keabu and Emma. But a moment later, her fears were allayed. A car turned into the driveway, and a slightly stout man of medium build and wearing a green tie parked and stepped out. Nancy rushed forward and told him in a low voice what had happened, including the fact that Janet Lee and Roy Chatley did not know that he was a detective. "Good," he said in a whisper. Aloud he called, "You'll love the island of Maui. Have a fine time." An hour later, the group were in the air. Nancy and Ned sat together and soon were discussing the various aspects of the mystery. "Tell me your idea of what the Na Kanata symbol may mean, Ned," Nancy said. "My guess is statuettes," he replied. "Perhaps there are 2 very valuable statuettes buried near some silversword plant." Nancy gazed out of the window at the greenish-blue water below her as she thought about this. Then she reflected that a silversword plant blooms only once, then dies. It was doubtful if Grandfather Sakamaki would have buried anything so valuable near something that was not permanent. "You probably have it all figured out," Ned remarked. "What's the answer?" Nancy smiled. "I'm guessing that the identical symbols mean brothers, and maybe even twins." "Okay, where does that get you?" Ned asked. Nancy had to admit that at this point her theorizing had reached a dead end. "Maui is not a large place," she mused. "But on the other hand, the island is not small either. It's going to be a real challenge to find the 2 men, if that's what the paper indicated." 40 minutes later, the pilot set his plane down at the Hana airport. A smiling Polynesian met them, and introduced himself as Moki Kuano. "Do you wish to stop at your hotel first, or shall we go directly to the crater?" he asked. "We don't want to miss anything," Bess spoke up. "What do you advise?" The Hawaiian guide smiled. "Perhaps we should go to the crater first. It is a long drive, but we should get there by sunset, and if we are lucky, you may see the Spectre of Brocken." "What's that?" Bert inquired. The guide explained that it was a phenomenon viewed from the rim of the crater when it was filled with clouds. "You'll see your reflection in a rainbow which circles the clouds." "Sounds spooky and wonderful," Bess remarked. Moki suggested that the travelers check their bags at the airport. He would come back for them later. The group agreed, since with 8 in the car there was no room for luggage. "I understand that the crater is 10,000 feet above sea level," said Ned. "Will this car be able to take all of us up to it?" There was a chuckle from Moki. "You just squeeze in. The car will do the rest." The travelers managed to settle themselves comfortably, though crowded in the tourist car. All of them were charmed with the old tree-shaded city of Hana, a cultural center of ancient Hawaii. Nancy learned that several retired professors and other students of volcanology and Polynesian lore lived there. Instantly, she thought of the symbols beneath the picture of the silver sword plant. "Maybe 2 men live here who can help me with the mystery," she told herself excitedly. Nancy's attention was diverted by Moki pointing out a gorgeous waterfall, and she suddenly realized how long she had been daydreaming. They were far out of town. On the way up the mountain, they passed fields of sugarcane and some of pineapple, but in the main this was ranch country, with cattle grazing on lush grass. About 2/3 of the way to the top, Moki suddenly stopped the car. "I will show you a silver sword plant," he said. Everyone alighted and followed him down a little incline over a gravelly, rocky section. Before them was the most amazing plant the visitors had ever seen. It stood some 10 feet in the air. From the lower part of the stalk grew a shower of leaves, which looked like hairy silver swords. Moki explained that hairs on the leaves kept out the sun's rays and prevented moisture escaping from the plant. The upper 6 feet of the plant was the flower itself. From the center stalk grew green foliage and hundreds of purple and yellow flowers. "Exquisite!" Hannah Gruen exclaimed. "This is certainly worth coming miles and miles to see." Moki said that the mainlanders were fortunate. This was not a spot where the plant usually grew. Smiling, he added that he thought this one had deliberately planted itself away from the crater proper to show off its beauty to the passers-by on the road. After the group had gazed at it in awe for a while, walking round the unusual plant several times, Moki said they must be on their way. The car climbed up the mountainside. When it finally reached the top, Nancy and her friends walked to the rim and stood breathless at the magnificent spectacle before them. Holding onto an iron railing, they gazed down into an enormous depression. But most amazing were the series of cinder cones, some as high as 800 feet, which Moki said were the result of volcanic eruptions. The whole scene was bathed in the glow of a brilliant red sunset. For a long time, the group stood speechless as Moki explained that the crater was 7 miles long and 2 miles wide. So interested were the sightseers that they hardly noticed the clouds gathering over the crater. In a short time, the area was filled with them, and suddenly a complete rainbow surrounded the clouds. "And look!" Bess cried out, pointing. "There's my reflection in the center of them." "And you do look like a spook," George remarked. Every one of the visitors was clearly reflected among the clouds. Nancy and George were particularly intrigued. Trying to see more from another vantage point, they walked a distance out on the cliff beyond the railing. George went a few steps ahead of Nancy. gazing into the clouds and not watching where she was going, she suddenly lost her balance. Nancy, seeing this, made a wild grab for her and caught hold of George's blouse. But the weight of George's body dragged the two of them over the side of the cliff. End of chapter 16.